part of Texas and New Mexico. We're in the Southwest Power Pool. We serve Michigan and Wisconsin, Minnesota and the two Dakotas and MISO, and then we serve Colorado, and we're the only single state operating company of our 8 states. And we're not in an RTO. We serve 1.6 million electric and 1.5 million gas customers, so we're dual fuel, both electric and gas, throughout the state of Colorado. This discussion, I will say, I had the privilege, I've been with Xcel for 3 years. I was at another Western utility for 7 years where I ran state and federal regulatory affairs, and then I was on the Missouri Public Utilities Commission for 6 years before that. Missouri was in both SPP and MISO. When I was in California, obviously interacted with the California Independent System Operator, CAISO. So I've had a broad array of experiences that have given me, fortunately or unfortunately, a broad perspective on some of these issues. And one of the things I'll say is that over at least the last 15, 17 years, I don't know that the conversation has largely changed in terms of the obstacles and challenges. And a lot of it boils down to not necessarily a discussion around the need for transmission, but the speed at which we're able to get it built, and then how we allocate costs across the regions. And those challenges seem to be perennial and constant, but it also feels like we're in a moment where there's greater sense of urgency and necessity to solve those problems. It's too bad that it usually takes a crisis to do it, but that's the moment I think in which we find ourselves. And I don't say a crisis in a negative sense, but the need for transmission is growing increasingly more acute, which I think is going to force us to have more of these types of conversations as we drive to solutions. So I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm just really excited to have this discussion.
Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Robert Taylor. Really excited to be here with the panel. Congrats to Abby for putting a good group together, and appreciate being part of it. So I've been with Invenergy now. Invenergy is one of the leading privately held clean energy developers in the country. We got our start as a natural gas development company and moved into wind, very much a solar and storage focus as well. Transmission is we've been working on transmission now for about 5 years. We have our flagship project, the Greenbelt Express project, which is still moving forward in the center of the country. We have an early stage development project in the west called New Mexico North Path. With the example that the pattern set there, we decided that looked really easy, and we were going to try and do the same thing. Sorry for the lightheartedness there, but that's the need is there. So personally, I've been with Invenergy for about 3.5 years. I came over from a PJM utility, spent a number of years there, mostly in the PJM stakeholder process, and also some time in MISO. So coming with kind of the RTO perspective as well, and some of those things that work and some of those things that maybe work less so. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned in kind of the positives and the negatives there. And then, had a stint with the Pennsylvania Energy Office and came out of the nuclear power industry. So, I think, and it's kind of interesting when you kind of hear from the group that's here, kind of a varied perspectives, right, of how some of these things are being solved. I think at a high level, I think we're asking some of the similar questions we have for a long time. The way that I typically describe it, though, is, the way that transmission projects are, you determine the need, who's going to pay for them, what are the processes. In some ways, we're asking bigger questions than we had before. We're asking more of the transmission system we had before. The changing resource mix, whether that is, wind and solar and the intermittent resources, or if it is, a natural gas, portfolio operating off of a similar, the same pipeline. What does that mean, and how those planning perspectives kind of move together, and what the transmission system is being asked to do. The other thing that I kind of like to use this at the stage, I'm a believer in utilities, that they do a phenomenal job within their footprint with what they're tasked with doing. And then you get the regionalization, whether that's the FERC planning regions or the RTOs within their footprint, within kind of the bounds of what's in their tariff and what they plan for. They do a really nice job with it. But I think one of the big gaps here that, I think maybe talk about some of these potential solutions today is like, who knits those regions together? That's kind of a gap right now, right? So we've had, the NERC study that was done is kind of showing some of the need that we think that there are significant and growing needs for interregional transmission. I always have to give a shout out to Rob Gramlich, who I think is the person who coined this term, is we need a transmission system bigger than the weather. I mean, we've done the analysis. You know that every second or third year, there is going to be a major impact somewhere on the U.S. electric grid that some significant region is going to have a very, very bad day. And if you don't have the generation capacity in your zone to handle it, and I think on those bad days, you don't, that's kind of something happens, whether it's weather or something else. And if you don't have strong ties to your neighbors or your neighbors' neighbors available to close the gap on those really bad days, it makes a really bad day worse. And whether that is fuel costs being securitized, up from a 3-day storm forward 15 or 20 years, whether that's rotating power blackouts, my personal story is like 3 years ago, driving home to East Tennessee, where I grew up, my parents had rotating power blackouts on Christmas Eve, 30 minutes every 4 hours. And, we need to have fewer of those. I mean, people depend on the grid. We need to have it. And so how you kind of move those things forward, I think we need to continue looking at that. And then some of the tools that we can talk about now about how to close that gap specifically in the West. And, maybe, some creativity that's being utilized here, I think is going to go a long way towards closing that gap. So appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Awesome. And yes, like you mentioned, quite a myriad of perspectives and experiences on this panel with folks who have built or are building or planning to build transmission projects. So maybe we'll start with you, Sarah. In your experience building and working on the SunZia project, what are some of the lessons learned there, some of the setbacks or successes that you'd like to share with us about that project?
Yeah. Boy, that's a doctoral thesis, but I'm going to try to, and a second cup of coffee or maybe a third. But to distill some of it, really think about this 550-mile T-line, taking an energy island, connecting it into load. The original idea, the original reason for SunZia was it's very difficult to build anything in California but solar. Right. And so we just knew, we saw the physics of the duck curve on the horizon, because obviously the shape of solar production is like this. Well, the reason you need a grid bigger than the weather is because you need to move the electrons around, however they're being produced, wherever they're being produced. And when you have non-correlated weather systems, you can create complementary products, right? And we're doing a lot more of energy products now. That's something I think people don't really understand. There's this kind of picking winners and losers amongst different generation forms, but as a power provider, we meet our customers where they are. Often they're investor-owned utilities. They say, I need a capacity product, or I need this shape, or this resource adequacy, and we create a product. So in this circumstance, here was California production. You look at eastern New Mexico, and you've got wind blowing on the shoulders. It's the exact perfect complement to that shape and profile. So we started going, there's a commercial opportunity here, right? I think one really big thing to highlight is, it's platitudinous, but you cannot get something done like this without massive stakeholder engagement. 3 cups of tea, the number of kitchen tables you sit around, the number of conversations, the concerns you hear and address from every single landowner. I'm not saying it's easier. It's a little easier in the West because you have big parcels of land, versus when you try to do it back East, it gets much, much more difficult. But think about this. This is all private capital. There is not a single penny of subsidy, not local, not state, not federal, and there is no eminent domain rights, right? So it is really just inch by inch, mile by mile. You've got to show up with benefits to the stakeholders in the communities. You got to listen to a lot of folks and talk to a lot of folks. And you got to bring the money people with you. And that's a good news thing now. Just like the politicians are waking up to the need for transmission, the money folks, the capital is on the sidelines now saying, how do we get into this game? And so making sure they're part of the equation early. We're seeing increased investment in transmission, entities. There's not that many of us, Invenergy being one of them. You've got Grid United, you've got Transwest. There's probably 10 that are really doing that. So I don't know if I have a silver bullet right now. I know we're going to get into some policy solutions, and people have talked about it yesterday. I will do a shout out for the infrastructure authorities. You put me near a microphone and I will talk about state infrastructure authorities, because that's the other thing I would say before I pass the mic. Governors matter and states matter really much more. We tend to get fixated on the federal level. As the feds reach down, the states need to reach up, and the state collaboration, and especially if they have infrastructure authorities, and it can be agnostic. It can be for oil pipelines, gas pipelines, transmission, just energy transportation. Before SunZia, our down payment on SunZia was Western Spirit. That was 1,000 megawatt generation facility enabled by a 150-mile T line. For that one, the RETA in New Mexico gave us access to eminent domain rights, but used as last resort. I think that's the conversation we should be having around eminent domain rights as last resort. Very, very managed, very heavily regulated. And for us, we only used it on 4 parcels. And that's because we could not find title. But the people had passed on, the family had lost track of the land. And so it's a very surgical use of eminent domain rights that was afforded us through the infrastructure authority that made a world of difference.
Yeah. And Robert, obviously the Xcel's project is different, but also quite similar in some of the challenges to SunZia, especially on sort of that community engagement or partnership aspect. What are you seeing, and what are some of the challenges or best practices that you've learned there?
You're referring to Power Pathway. And before I get to Power Pathway, Robert, you just reminded me of the Invenergy project, the Greenbelt Express. I dealt with that when I was on the Missouri Commission, and it was the subject of that book, Superpower. Yep. And that's been 15 years ago. Yep. And the lessons remain the same. I'll say community engagement, community engagement, community engagement. So I was on the commission when that project was slated to go across 8 counties in Missouri. And I'm from Missouri. And I learned new phrases, century farm and other things. And the notion of using eminent domain was something that was anathema to the rural landowners and caused significant concern and uproar. And that project, we had public participation hearings twice a day in every single county. They would start at noon, go to 6. They would start again at 6 and go to 11 o'clock at night. There was a lot of emotion and passion around that. And that project actually informed a lot of my thinking as I've gone from being a commissioner to working at 2 different utilities. And seeing the public outcry and response really hits home the notion that community engagement is critical for a whole host of reasons. And we can talk more about the value proposition of the infrastructure that we build, and that should be part of the discussions too. But Power Pathway, and I can't take credit for all this because it started before I arrived at the company, but we did a significant amount of community engagement 18 to 24 months before we even finalized the routing. And that was critical because we were able to take in that public commentary and actually make changes to the routing based upon what we heard from those communities, some of which weren't in our service territory. So that made it even more challenging that we were building a transmission line that was going to cut through land for customers that we didn't even serve. And so it didn't completely eliminate a lot of the consternation and a lot of the pushback that we've gotten, and we're still dealing with some of that. But for a multi-county, multi-jurisdictional project, the amount of community engagement that we did ahead of time, and it was very focused, open houses, very transparent. It was social media campaigns. It was using our website to be as transparent as possible. I think that rather than having 2 counties that have opposed the project, we would have had significantly more.
And is your experience at Invenergy similar, or?
Yeah, I mean, it broadly is, right? I mean, and I think this is one where I think, Sarah, the difference is, between kind of the utility model, for better or worse. If Public Service Colorado is going out and talking to landowners, they know who you are. They know that you're there to provide reliable service. If you're coming in as a non-incumbent, you have to start with who is Invenergy. So when there's just no shortcuts for that, right? So if you're coming through a town, you need to do those outreach, you need to build those relationships, you need to bring people together. We've got a strong team of folks. That's their job, is just to kind of reach out and do that. And it's not them doing it on an island. It's them working in and bringing the technical experts in and making sure that that feedback is being incorporated into the design, into the route. And there's not a shortcut. There's not an easy button for that. The other thing is like, to be in a situation to try to explain what merchant transmission is to landowners is not a place that anybody wants to be. It doesn't fit the narrative, well, you're not the utility, you're not serving me, starting with that. I mean, there again, it just, taking the time, building the relationships, finding agents of trust in the community to bring those things together, to bring it down to the kitchen table where you can have those conversations and talk about why that is, and to build a very kind of clear benefit structure for the communities and why it's there and what it's going to be used for.
I can't get my dad to understand what it is. So.
Yeah, that's kind of a good point. And we were talking to somebody yesterday talking about like having AI videos or songs or something that can kind of communicate.
We need to build some TikTok.
Yeah.
That's what we need to
do. I'll get right on that.
There actually was a YouTube video that talked about Greenbelt, one of like those explainer videos. We didn't necessarily, it's like it's a little tongue in cheek and I did mention this. I went to grad school and met my wife at Missouri and Columbia. So there is a couple of jabs thrown at Kansas in the video. So we didn't exactly make too much hay out of the video, but there are people that can do it.
So I guess in terms of communicating that value proposition, maybe beyond communities, whether that's to ratepayers, or regulators, investors, what are some of the strategies there that you've found to be particularly successful?
I would say the first strategy is to not denigrate other people's business models or technologies, right? It was a lovely kumbaya moment here when Robert was like, hey, I love utilities. That's not always the case, right? This can be like the sharks and the jets up here, y'all. But we really are, to your point, crisis, I think, is a good word. It's the Rahm Emanuel, let no crisis go to waste. And I think it's forcing partnerships, more openness. And we certainly share that view. Heaven knows I don't want your job. I'm so grateful you're doing it, right? And vice versa. Yeah, it's a great job. Well, so is mine. But I mean, the interregional is a different nut to crack, right? So this collaboration and coordination. So just speaking ill of other technologies or other business models is an absolute non-starter. I think it's also important to be extremely truthful and grounded in the facts, and not just the facts of what you want, what your vision is. It's the facts of the grid, right? You have to be a good custodian of the grid. It doesn't matter if it advantages your bottom line, if it advances your pipeline, right? So first of all, it's got to be the right project, the right time, right location, and good for the grid, right? And then you really also need to be able to explain the physics and the economics of why it's the right thing, right? So this does not lend itself. There's some advocacy and lobbying that you can skate across the surface and Senator, can I get your vote on this if we play some golf? This is not that. This stuff is a grind. So I think, kind of radical honesty and really understanding what they care about, right? A landowner is going to care fundamentally about something entirely different set of concerns than a banker, right? And the last thing I would say is also, I think you need to acknowledge up front, hey, we build transmission. That's great. We make money when we build transmission, although we take the risk that we make money. But the best transmission is the transmission you never have to build, right? So actually being upfront, like reconductoring, let's do that. Let's do that. Like grid enhancing technologies. We need, with the surge in demand we're facing, we absolutely need everything. And so put that on the table and start with that, and the conversation goes much better.
So I'll echo the notion of meeting people where they are and tailoring your message for your audience. And I've got a couple of examples of that. And one's from when I was in Missouri. I'll use that as an example again, and talking to a state legislator who told me this was when we were drafting the rules for our renewable portfolio standard. And the thing that he said to me was, he just summarily right off the bat said, I don't believe in climate change. And so don't come in here talking to me about that renewable stuff for purposes of climate change. The conversation then shifted, and we had a discussion about the job creation, the tax base, the lease payments to landowners. And it was at that point that his whole demeanor changed. And he said, keep talking about that. Talk about what it means from an economic development standpoint. And so, again, it is another example of how you've got to meet people where they are. I will say with regulators, one of the things that I've been, and I can say this as a former regulator, regulators go to a lot of conferences and they hear things from a lot of vendors and probably some of y'all that might be in this room, and they'll take that to mean that by using grid enhancing technologies or dynamic line rating or reconductoring that we can completely avoid building new infrastructure. And it's just, please know that it doesn't mean that. And this is, so I think that radical transparency, that radical honesty applies in equal force, particularly with regulators, policymakers that may or may not have the deep knowledge of the physics that you all do and that we do. And so making sure that they understand exactly what the technology can and cannot accomplish. Because what I've said is with grid enhancing technologies, we absolutely need to do everything that we can to maximize the efficiency of the existing transmission network. That doesn't mean we're going to completely avoid building new transmission. It may mean that we can avoid building as much, but we're not going to avoid building it altogether. And the discussions nowadays are really focused toward, at least at the policymaking level, the cost, the price, the value of those, and what it's going to mean for customers from an affordability standpoint. So that's being very realistic and being very honest about what technologies can and cannot do.
Well, I mean, the only thing I'll kind of add on to that though is, when you look at the West in particular, and a lot of us spend some time back east, and you've got the organized markets and the RTOs. Those institutions, in all cases, were designed decades ago. They were implemented for a very specific set of tasks, and to the benefit at this point. And you'll hear me say this a couple of times. It's like half exciting and half terrifying. But one of the things about the West is you don't have that baggage. I mean, the RTOs, they do some things really, really well, but they are a creature of the tariff that they operate under. And if you're asking a question that isn't kind of described in that tariff, inaction is the default. So in the West, there's space for creativity. There's space for people like Pattern that go inch by inch and push these projects through. And we're really excited to see that project come online. There's space for the transmission authorities and how you ask these questions and really come at it with a focus of convening and bringing people together to describe those benefits and those needs and try and move forward together in a kind of a collaborative way. The other thing to touch on is the Western Transmission Consortium. A couple of the folks are here. I'm very optimistic about the direction there of, let's take a look at these plans that we've kind of done over and over again, and let's try and bring the people together to decide to actually go build them. So you've got that space for creativity. You're not necessarily bound in the same way to some of the processes that exist in other places. Take advantage of that, and I think the conversations are happening, and I know we're a part of some of those, and really excited to see those move forward as well.
I love that idea, creativity. I hadn't thought about that. I mean, that's what we do, right? We aren't constrained in the West, right? In the same ways. That was so well said, Robert. So we have a proposed transmission line. We got all sorts of stuff. It's not just SunZia. We got stuff we're doing now and stuff on the horizon. Some we're talking about, some we're not right now. And one of them is, our developers were looking at load centers, say, hey, wait, we've got Salt Lake here and we've got Las Vegas here and we got a ton of geothermal here, right? And so, there's some ingredients in the test kitchen. What can we do with that? How do we ideate around these core things? We have, generation, we have demand, and we have data centers that are being proposed. So let's go look at that. Let's be creative. I love that idea.
Switching gears a little bit, I know, Sarah, you mentioned 18 years for the SunZia project, which is really no joke. Yeah. And, on the efficiency aspect, I know that's something we definitely need to improve on some of these timelines. What are some of your recommendations or thoughts there?
Yeah. First of all, since you use the word efficiency, I'll just highlight that interregional transmission is hyper efficient, right? You actually, if you invest in the right types of transmission, you actually don't have to build as much generation, because there's a lot of inefficiency and stranded capabilities on the grid as it is now because it's too vulcanized. When you free them up, you create these super highways and start moving them around. It actually is very beneficial for ratepayers, right? Then, I mean, you see time and time again, the numbers are, 4x, 5x, 6x, that the investment in transmission results in a substantial, like 4 or 5x lowering of utility bills for consumers, right? So you used efficiency. So it's just, first of all, I know it's a touchy subject, but we are here to talk about policy and some recommendations at the federal level. Judicial reform is necessary. I mean, just full stop. Our T-line got litigated. It was heartbreaking for us because we'd done everything we could in terms of stakeholder engagement. Got litigated 9 years after the federal decision had been issued, right? And that's just, you can't build great things in a country where that is the standard course of action, right? So I think judicial reform is important. Also, this one's a very obvious idea, but it just doesn't always play out this way. Concurrent instead of iterative review processes, either the state or federal level, when you have environmental review or any other, grid studies, if you can stack these instead of make them linear, you can claw back a lot of time, right? And then I think also right now, to rise this moment, I would recommend we need to take a hard look at DOE and FERC authorities and see how we can push them, we can expand them, right? Are our historical read of these authorities quite modest, and are they meeting the moment? Is there now, I'm not saying government overreach, but this goes back to litigation. Is there a way where we can create some more breathing room where the statutes that are already on the books can empower more decisive action?
Well, just to build on that, I mean, I think the governor's letter that went in earlier this week that came out, I mean, that's a good step. I mean, there's some common sense things in there to have that group of governors and to see governors being the ones that are pushing that at the federal level, I think is very important. And the other thing, and just to kind of touch on something that Sarah said, is like, transmission is efficient. I would also say transmission of all of the technologies you're talking about on the grid, it's the least regrets option. If you're making significant investments in generation, you're tied to a fuel source, you're tied to a location. Transmission is something that when it's there, even if you don't end up, being there for that exact purpose you built it for, it enables optionality later. It enables leaning on it, if the resources you thought to be there aren't going to be there. And this is one of those things. And this is, a number of years ago, kind of an eye-opening moment I had. We were looking at some of the PJM build out, the history of the build out of the 500 kV network in the Mid-Atlantic. When you look at that plan and when that was designed, there's a lot of substation names on there that don't make a lot of sense. It was kind of built out and negotiated by the utilities at the time. There was a lot of nuclear plants and a lot of large fossil plants that never got built. And, we had a conversation, and it was actually in a PJM stakeholder meeting. A colleague of mine who was at a renewable developer at the time was saying, people were worried about, building too much and stranded assets. And he's like, we built this. And like half of the plants that were on that plan to justify the build out of the 500 kV ring in the Mid-Atlantic never got built. But there's not a time when that system, I mean, that's the backbone of the grid, and it was fully utilized within the first couple of years. Transmission is to some extent, I'll caveat this in a second, but it is the closest thing we're gonna have to build it and they will come. That doesn't mean it's a blank check. We need to be thoughtful. We need to kind of put in a plan, but the way the timelines work, you're going to have to make a decision with the best information you have to kind of put together a transmission plan to enable the next steps. So we want to be thoughtful about that. We know that rising bills are going to be, are critically important at this point. So you're making decisions about where scarce dollars are going to be used. But I think transmission is one of those things. It's the least regret and have one of the best benefit to cost ratios you're going to see. And I really kind of applaud the efforts to move that forward.
So I'm reflecting on your question. I'm thinking, what's the problem we're trying to solve? Is it speed? Is it cost allocation? Is it building across state lines? It's all of the above. And I kind of go back to what I said before. I remember, because I'm reflecting on Sarah, your comment about expanding federal authority. And I'll say that seems like an option, but I know that state regulators guard their prerogatives and states are going to be parochial. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. That's their job. And so the notion of expanding federal authority always makes me a little nervous because I ask, what's the problem that we're trying to solve? And one of the questions, I'll just ask this as a provocative question, this problem we're solving today is probably not the same problem we were solving when FERC Order 1000 came around. And FERC Order 1000 wanted to try to drive more interregional building, and it wanted to drive cost allocation. In a world in which states now are building tremendous amounts of renewables to serve their own native load, is the problem the same today as it was 20 years ago? And I'd argue that it's, I mean, maybe my question presupposes the answer, but are we solving the same problem today that we were trying to solve 15 years ago? I would argue that we're not. But I do think that, going back to your original premise, we do need siting and permitting reform, whatever that looks like. But certainty and predictability are always important. It shouldn't take 18 years to get a piece of infrastructure built under any circumstances. And if that's a function of overregulation, or if it's a function of unclear regulation, that's something we can solve. That's a policy issue. It's not a physical issue. And so I just think it's a delicate balance between asking the state to have greater authority and being very clear about the problem that we're solving first.
Sort of outside of authorities for policies, Robert mentioned the consortium, and we talked about some potential creative solutions. But are there other sort of workforce initiatives or broader initiatives or energy goals, policies, institutional reforms that could play a role here, or there's a needed gap that needs to be filled?
Oh, I mean, workforce, we could have a whole seminar on workforce, right? No, I mean, heck, go try to hire a nuclear engineer right now, right? Absolutely. I mean, I don't even know where to start with that, but on a macro level, we absolutely need more electrical engineers. We need to be encouraging young people to go into these sciences. And I'm pretty darn sure those are pretty resilient jobs that aren't going to be taken out by AI, right? So let's go. That can be our bumper sticker. At the local level, though, it's very serious also. I mean, we hired, so for the 550-mile transmission line, we hired damn near every single IBEW worker in a 3-state region, right? They had the skills, right? And delivered the quality product. We also are in the West, more geographically, diffuse, where we have very big tracts of land. And so you have to think about workforce location, workforce safety when they're having to commute a couple of hours each direction to get to their job, whether it's a construction site or a generation facility. So you also need to think about local benefits and local access. So we are regularly partnering with either the state universities or the community colleges to do, tech trainings. Right? You cannot be passive right now. If you're in a sector, if you're in generation and transmission, you have to be very active about workforce. We even, given how remote our generation assets are in New Mexico, we're looking at developing housing, and that's not what we do for a living. We're developers, but it's not housing. So it's a great question. And one of the good things is there's a lot of partners thinking about that. So my recommendation would be, let's talk to one another. Let's not always recreate the wheel, and let's sit around some common tables. Like the Clean Power Institute is very focused on energy workforce development. So let's try to knit ourselves together, because if we do it each separately, it's going to be wildly inefficient.
I'd say, in addition to workforce development, which is really, really important, the other issues that we're facing are just supply chain issues that continues, and it's not solely related to being in a post-COVID world. So supply chains were disrupted during COVID, but now what we're seeing is competition even outside of our industry. So I think about building large transmission projects. You have to have concrete to be able to pour footings, and we're competing with AI developers and housing developers for raw materials. And so that's a significant challenge as well. One of the successes, or one of the, I guess, innovative things that we did with Power Pathways, we're working with an EPC contractor. We had a performance incentive mechanism imposed on us by the commission for that project for time and on time and on budget performance incentive mechanisms. We brought in an EPC contractor to help manage the project, who within the contract, they also have performance incentive mechanisms. And so they benefit if we're on time and under budget to the same degree that we do. And so they were then also able to source materials, source labor. It's been a really I don't say it's unique because it's not singular, but it was a creative and new way of working with a general contractor to co-manage the project with us. That's been very useful and helpful in being able to locate labor and materials, and has allowed us to bring that project in. It's on time and under budget so far. That is indeed. It is indeed.
I don't have much to add. I mean, I think those are phenomenal answers. And, you know, like if we could solve workforce development and supply chain, I think we're going to be doing pretty darn well.
One of the things I'll say that's maybe, you know, not this is like an education issue, but being able to partner with your union and your local community colleges and other institutions of higher learning in your geographic footprint. And then this is just something that's incumbent upon all of us, is to destigmatize an associate's degree or a professional degree that's a non-4-year degree. Our society has a bias toward that. One of the things I often talk about when I talk about Xcel, we are a utility that delivers electrons and gas molecules. But even more than that, we're actually an infrastructure company that builds infrastructure. And we have 3,900 employees and coworkers around the state of Colorado. Half of those or more are unionized coworkers that are in jobs that pay them 6 figures that don't require a college education. And that's a narrative that we don't often talk about, is we have to destigmatize the notion of not getting a 4-year degree and make these jobs more attractive. And that's something I've been really focused on.
Totally.
Well, I do want to leave time for audience questions. If any of you have questions or comments for our panel, raise your hand and we'll get you a mic.
Hi, Doug Howell, EF consultant. 2 questions. They're related. And that, Sarah, you talked about the prolonged implementation of SunZia, permitting and lawsuits slow that down. And there seems to be a growing assumption that with early engagement before any technical work is done on routing and siting, and you front load that you can save money on the back end by reducing permitting and the lawsuits. So questions for all of you. First question, do you believe that it's a better economic investment to do the community engagement first before you draw any lines on a map? And a lines on the map at distinction. West Tech has lines on the map. CETA in their gap analysis has lines on the map. They go bend over backwards to explain that that's not a definitive line going through your backyard. So what I'm talking about is the engineering stuff that traditionally happens behind closed door, routing and siting. Do you believe that, one, it's more economical to front load the community engagement before you do those lines on the map? And are you committed, each of you as 3 different companies, to doing that?
Yes.
So absolutely. I would say it's a chicken and egg. You do have to do some viability engineering first. So you're not just out peddling fiction. You know, I'm not trying to send you, it's like hope is not a strategy, you know, this just pointing on a map like this is not a T-line. So you do have to do some upfront investments before you go and talk to anyone to develop some level of conviction that this is a viable line. And that's what we said even about the creativity with, you know, you got Salt Lake here, you've got Las Vegas here, you've got geothermal here. You kind of can, then you do a fatal flaw for environmental, for example. Are there waterways? Are there other things? So do that up front so you've got some conviction. And then absolutely go out, talk early and often. And that was done on SunZia, but again, that was 550 miles across, 3 states. And that's a little shocking, right? To say we did that and it took 18 years, but that's not dispositive because no infrastructure like this goes under cover of night. And maybe it never would have gotten done if we hadn't done that. And you absolutely have to be willing to listen through tribal consultation, through environmental consultation. There are things you don't know. You don't have God knowledge of all of these areas. And so you have to be prepared to have a margin of redirection and change and adaptation. Otherwise, it's not real stakeholder engagement. Otherwise, it's just glad handing. So you have to do it in substantively. And yes, I do believe that pays dividends on the back end in terms of a lot of fees of like engineering, permitting, timelines, that type of stuff.
So definitively, yes. It's hard to prove a negative. Like, had you not done it, would it have taken you 20 years instead of 18? So it's challenging, but intuitively and logically, yeah, it's going to pay dividends. And I'd also say there's no downside to it. So why not do it and build goodwill with your customers and your communities? The power pathway is 500 miles. It's 345 kV double circuit along the Eastern Plains, multiple counties. It's all intra-state, so it's slightly different, but we still have to go county by county because we don't have statewide permitting here in Colorado. So we have to go county by county. And I'm confident that had we not done the work that we did, 18 months in advance, that we would have had more than 2 of our counties. It's 2 of like 6 or 8 counties that we have to get permits from. I'm confident we would have had problems with more than 2 of those counties. I'd also say, for us, if I take a step back, we are building transmission, we are building generation and distribution. So we're building infrastructure across the entire value stream of the electron. And then we have a natural gas system that I have to maintain as well. We do a lot of community outreach and education and engagement because we are always in our communities. And what we've learned is that the gone are the days where the utility is invisible to customers and communities. And because of all of the discussions around the cost and the price of the product that we provide, and I'm avoiding using the term affordability intentionally, but because of the increased focus on the costs of the product that we provide, the infrastructure that's required to provide it, people are paying more attention to us. And so we know that we're going to file rate cases. That's what utilities do. And you probably are reading about this. All utilities around the country are announcing 40, 50, 60, 70 billion dollar capital plans over a 5-year period across TD, energy supply, and natural gas. That obviously has the attention of regulators, policymakers, customers. And so we know that we've got to do a very different job of articulating the value proposition of all of the infrastructure that we're going to be building. And it's inherently the right thing to do, but it also makes your job easier in front of policymakers. And so I'm very confident that we have to do it. We have to do it early. We have to do it with radical transparency, and we have to do it across all of the infrastructure that we're building.
Yeah, and so I'll certainly endorse everything that's been said there. And just to kind of add a couple of components there. One, yes, it's the right thing to do, right? I mean, yes, the planning, the initial stage work, to have those conversations, to know what you're talking about. You need to kind of do the due diligence. Does this work? Then you can start getting into the micrositing of where this is and have the conversations with the communities. I think the other thing, I think you're hearing this from all 3 of us, and I think this is because of the 3 institutions we're from. The term that we use for this is we come into these projects with an owner's mentality. We're not coming in to do a project, flip it, and leave town. We're coming in, those initial conversations we're having about, hey, we think we might have a project in your area on your land. We're making those introductions and talking about that project with an intention to be there for decades. And so building those relationships and treating people like, you have an expectation to be there, not, I think all 3 of us are similarly situated there, but that's not the case for everybody. So like, if you've got a bad actor that can do things, it can make life much more difficult the next time around. But then, the second piece of this answer is explaining some of these processes to the general public is hard. And, different parts of the country. And I think thus far, maybe, other than, California is like, the Eastern regions, if you're responding to a solicitation, you're being, like the process is you need to draw a line on a map and put in a cost contained bid saying, this is what I'm going to do. And you're doing it in a 4-month or 6-month window. One, there's not time to do that community outreach in the right way. So you kind of have to put that bid in, with the route, but then you need to caveat it in those ways. Like, yes, we are confident that we can do something along these lines, knowing that as soon as you get an award from an RTO, you're going to come back and have those conversations and get into, okay, what is this actually going to look like, and validate what those assumptions were and take that feedback in to make sure that you've got a project that's going to move forward with that strategy in place.
Yeah, Robert said something really worth emphasizing. Basically, energy literacy, electricity literacy. You would be, well, you guys wouldn't be shocked, you're pros, but I mean, it is shocking how little people know about electricity. So we're starting from behind. And I was having a conversation with Jim Robb over at NERC a few weeks ago in DC and said, how do we help elected officials really understand the magnitude of this challenge and what we're trying to do? He was very kind about it. He said, well, that's a little tough given that most elected officials still think electricity comes from the wall. Like, okay.
Hi, Dolly Edmonds with Audubon, and just wanted to first start off and say thank you, Sarah. I didn't get to work on SunZia, but I had colleagues that did, and so appreciate the opportunity to be able to have conversations with y'all and recognize that you were trying to minimize impacts and being open to those.
Y'all were a tremendous partner on that project. Thank
Right.
you.
Question is actually for Robert on Power Pathway. It's kind of a multi-part question. First, it's can you let us know where the project stands? And follow up to the panel discussion yesterday, curious about how co-locating along highways was part of your decision-making. I'm thinking I-70 specifically. And then also curious as to how engagement with Colorado Parks and Wildlife went.
So the first question is, it's in 5 groups or 5 segments. We've completed work on one of them thus far. We expect to be, so we started the project in 2021 and began construction in 2023. So it was a very fast process, and that was from the application at the commission through approval and construction. And so we're on time, we're under budget. We have 2 counties on one of the segments that did not give us the permits that we needed. In Colorado, the Public Utility Commission has backstop authority to overrule the decision of a local community, of a city or county. We obviously, to my earlier point, similarly with eminent domain, we don't want to usurp the prerogatives of the county until we absolutely have to. And so spent a lot of time with El Paso and Elbert counties trying to allay the concerns of the communities there, but we were not successful in that regard. They denied our permits. So we have 2 pending proceedings at the commission. On a parallel path, we have proceedings that are in circuit court so that we can get the permits that we need so we can stay on time and on budget. We built into the schedule some of this eventuality because we understood that there would be some communities that would oppose the project. So we expect that even with the PUC processes, that we'll still be on time. The second question, with routing in the rights of way, we try to make sure that we are being as least disruptive as possible. I can't tell you specifically on which parts of the route, because it's 500 miles, where we did locate in an existing public right of way, but we want to make sure that we're locating either in existing rights of way that we already have, or rights of way that are on existing roads, and we have partnerships with the state to be able to co-locate equipment and infrastructure in existing rights of way. And we try to do that as much as possible, not just with transmission, but with distribution infrastructure as well. So, and then your third question was, how did we work with Parks and Wildlife? I will confess, I haven't heard that we've had any specific issues with Parks and Wildlife. We do have, and this is not on a transmission project. This is actually on a wind farm that we're working on right now, where we have some challenges with a burrowing owl, and we've had to halt construction because we make sure that we are adhering to state and federal law. And so I'd say we have constructive relationships with both our federal and state partners, where we're working on federal lands, or where there are sensitive habitats or endangered species. We make sure that we're following all the laws.
Abby, I recently learned a new number. And if I can leave the room with this number, because I found it staggering, and it really defines the challenge, and my gratitude for everyone in the room focusing on these issues. I've been working with a group called Open Minds, and they have a grid vision program, and they're working with Bain on that. And they asked Bain to run some analytics. And Bain came back and identified that China right now is building 20,000 miles of transmission every single year. 20,000 miles. Now, if you normalize for landmass, you know, the US land footprint versus China, our equivalent would need to be just to keep up. And this is talking AI arms race here, which is a very real thing and one of this White House's absolute top priorities. So we should all be linking transmission to AI and energy dominance. It would need to be 5,000 miles a year, and we're in the hundreds on a good year.
Well, certainly a long way to go, but would like to thank all three of you for your leadership and for your participation on this panel. Please join me in thanking our panelists.